difference going on. Good morning, everyone. Welcome to Preserving Nordic Heritage, Reimagining Historic Churches Through the Lens of Folk Arts and Culture. Myself and Margit are going to introduce ourselves here in just a second, but we were supposed to be joined by our third party, Nancy, and unfortunately she has COVID. So she is not here with us today, but we will do our best to present about Trondhjem as well. My name is Emily Sajdak. I am a senior project manager with Partners for Sacred Places, which is a national nonprofit organization dedicated to the sound stewardship and active community use of America's older and historic religious properties. Partners for Sacred Places manages this program we call the Nordic Churches Project. We are based in Philadelphia. I myself am based out of Chicago, but I was born in Minnesota, in Minneapolis. So coming back to Minnesota always feels like home. Margit, I'll let you say a little bit and introduce yourself and we'll get started.
Good morning. I'm Margit Johnson and I am a Northfield resident. I've lived there about 50 some years, having gone to school there. And about 4 years ago, I joined the Valley Grove Preservation Society board. And I am one of 3 so-called townies who are on the board. Happily, the rest of the board, the other 8 or 9 members, live in the area of Valley Grove. So the rural church, rural neighbors, several of them have generations of family members buried in the adjacent cemetery. So I rely heavily on those folks to bring the deep history of Valley Grove to our deliberations as we pursue trying to preserve these 2 buildings that I'll talk a little bit more about. So I look forward to showing you some photos and talking a bit about the tapestry project.
Right. So first, some broad overview about the project. We'll talk about 2 specific instances, and then we're going to open the floor to questions. So hope that you're all ready for discussion early in the morning, first thing. So between 1820 and 1920, a period of a century, over 2 million immigrants came to the United States, particularly to the American Midwest from Nordic countries, that being Norway, Sweden, Finland, Denmark, and Iceland. These settlements made a significant impact on the cultural landscape of the Midwest, of the region, and the churches built by these immigrants are some of the best examples of decorative arts, traditions, and customs from these communities. Increasingly, churches built by these Nordic communities are at risk due to changing demographics and shrinking populations. By highlighting cultural heritage, Partners for Sacred Places endeavors to demonstrate that these Nordic American churches are, number 1, deeply embedded in their communities, and 2, that their buildings, community engagement, and traditions are significant community and civic assets. This program, the Nordic Churches Project, has been around since 2018. It's in 2 parts, really. So the first is that we have a searchable online inventory of over 1,500 extant churches across the region from all of these ethnicities. And this is really the first effort to bring all of this together in one place. So a lot of this data has been with state historic preservation offices or various ethnic groups. This is really the first attempt to bring all of this together in one database. And then the second piece of this project is support for a small group of churches committed to sustaining their buildings, decorative arts, and involvement in their communities. So in this session, I'm going to give you sort of the broad overview of what this program looks like, but we are really going to highlight 2 local participants, Valley Grove Preservation Society in Nerstrand, Minnesota, and Trondhjem Community Preservation Society in Lonsdale, Minnesota. Both of these churches are of Norwegian heritage and recently commissioned works of art by artists specializing in Nordic folk art and traditions. And I know I saw some of you looking at these ahead of time, but we brought some of the examples of this art here. So please feel free to check that out. The goal of the project is to make folk arts and culture of Nordic American communities in the Upper Midwest more deeply understood and broadly recognized. And the program focuses primarily on historic folk arts and crafts, so tangible things, and building trades, where these were the product of immigrant generation of artisans. So we're thinking about skills for building, so masons, brickworkers, carpenters, and also decoration, so wood carvers, painters, artisans, metal workers, that sort of artwork as well. Some of the designs that you'll see in these churches reflect formally trained architects and artisans, and some of these are very much folk arts and folk craftspeople who maybe had more informal apprenticeships or learned through experience. Logistically, the opportunities that both Valley Grove and Trondhjem participated in operated in two parts, highlighted by grant opportunities in each. So the first phase, when both of these churches entered the program in 2018, was an opportunity for restoration and repair grants for these churches. So thinking about things like foundations, altar painting restorations, those sorts of projects, as well as wraparound services. We offered a training to both of these churches around how to tell their story, how to build new partnerships and relationships in the communities, and also how to pursue outside funding resources. And then the second phase of grant opportunities was for folk art. So each of these churches commissioned works of folk art by Nordic folk artists who and then the churches planned community events and engagement around these pieces. And both Valley Grove and Trondhjem participated in both of those phases. This project serves both active congregations and active nonprofits in a range of geographic situations. So our project is bounded by the Dakotas, Minnesota, Iowa, Wisconsin, and the Upper Peninsula of Michigan. And by those ethnicities that I mentioned earlier. All of these churches, there's 25 in total at this point, represent rural situations, urban and small town settings, and two cohorts so far. So the first cohort has been 17 churches, and we just brought together our new cohort of 8, so 25 churches in total, 4 of whom are in Minnesota. And I also want to just take a few minutes to talk about folk arts more broadly and generally, as this is something that maybe some of us who are in preservation circles are maybe a little less familiar, and maybe Nordic folk arts in particular. Folk arts are things that are deeply embedded in community life and express the identity and values of the groups that create and use them. They can be tangible, so food, material objects, buildings. Here you see an example of an altar in a church in South Dakota, but they can also be intangible, so customs, traditions. Many Nordic churches have food events. So we're all in lutefisk. I was going to say, we're all familiar with lutefisk in Minnesota. We may have variable feelings on lutefisk. In the Danish tradition, æbleskiver, these little, I don't even know how to describe them, round pastries, holiday traditions. So Icelandic communities celebrate something called the Deuce of August. Norwegians celebrate 17. Mai. Calendar customs as well. So the Swedes often have midsummer poles. We have a couple of churches in this cohort who have midsummer pole traditions. But all of these churches house community arts and treasures, carved altar surrounds and pulpits. So here again, this one here at Our Savior's Lutheran in South Dakota. Weather vanes, so ironwork, embroidered altar cloths. So if any of you are familiar with hardanger in particular, and painted designs are all things that you can find in these churches. Wood carving is probably one of the most most important and widespread folk arts that you'll see in these churches. Frequently, it'll be relief carving. I don't know if I have a button, but up here on the top left, this is an example of acanthus carving, which is done in a relief style, which is something that you see with some frequency. If you're familiar with Stav church productions, Danish model ships is something that's particularly interesting. So you'll see here this ship model in the Danish tradition. They were a very seafaring nation, and they brought in this tradition that has carried through to Danish churches here in America, where you'll see a ship hanging in the center of the church, down the center aisle usually. And this can mean a variety of different things. It can represent safe journey in general, safe journey across the sea from Denmark to America, weathering the storms of life, but also the transition from this life to the next. So there's a lot of imagery that can be tied to these sort of ships, but particularly in the Danish tradition, you'll see quite a few of these ships. Painting is also something that you will see across the region in many of these churches. Much of the altar and decorative painting, fascinatingly, is not based in folk tradition initially, but on styles of well-known, more formally trained Western painters or painting styles. But many of these churches feature altar paintings in the style of the Lutheran churches of the sending country in particular, and many of them show scenes of the life of Christ. Christ in Gethsemane is one that you will see over and over and over again. These may have been ordered from catalogs or commissioned from artists with varying levels of training. Professionally, many of these artisans were very active in the 1880s in particular. And one of the really interesting things illustrated on this slide, your bottom left. So this church, one of the things you'll see, they brought this altar back from Norway. And one of the interesting things that's different from ones that you'll see in America that were made here versus brought over from Norway is that wood carving that was made here in America is very, it's not painted. So it's more plain. It highlights the play of the positive and negative in the wood carving, like you'll see in the top photo. And for those that were brought over from the sending countries, it was much more common to feature painted. So this one is an example of a painted altar. Stenciling is also something you'll see, and you can see it a little bit in the top. These ones, it's very common to not know who the artist was in those situations. Often these were copied from books. So it could have been anyone who had done this stenciling. And in most cases, we don't know who would have done it. Rose mauling is something that you also might be very familiar with. There's a little bit here in the bottom corner. Also, interestingly enough, it's very rare to find rose mauling, at least historically in that first immigrant generation. It's less common to see rose mauling in the churches, but you do see it occasionally. And then you can see this also in their architecture, folk arts in the architecture. So some of these designs followed pattern books from the 19th century. Some were set on precedents from the home country. So I mentioned Stav churches. This one is in Washington Island, Wisconsin. There's a great one in Rapid City, South Dakota. And we were just talking before the session about one in Moorhead as well. They also would adapt from local fieldstone in particular. So this one in South Dakota here on the bottom left is local fieldstone, but they brought special pink stones from Norway. So it's a mix of both local fieldstone and pink stones from Norway within these churches. And then while many of these churches are very highly decorative, certain traditions, like the Finnish Apostolic Lutheran tradition, are much more plain. So you'll see here, this is a very a plain church, but a very beautiful architectural style in its simplicity as well. And then also stained glass. So less to say here, but you'll see that notably many of these churches feature stained glass throughout their buildings as well. I'll turn it over to Margaret to talk about Valley Grove.
Adjustment here. Can everyone hear clearly? Okay, good. So first, thanks to Emily for inviting me and Nancy to be part of this presentation. And I have my mask as a tribute to Nancy and hoping that she is recovering quickly. So I'm here on behalf of the Valley Grove Preservation Society. And at Valley Grove, there are these two churches that stand on a very high knoll. From that place, you can see 20 miles to the north and the east, and to the south, which is at the top of the photo, on the other side of a deep valley is Nerstrand Big Woods State Park. It's one of the remaining stands of the big woods that covered southeastern Minnesota long before European settlement. This tapestry is one of 4 story tapestries by Minneapolis weaver Robbie LaFleur, created on commission with a grant from the Partners for Sacred Places. It illustrates the wealth of wildlife that sustained the Dakota for generations, and later the settlers who added their own cows and pigs. When the 1851 and 1854 treaties of Traverse des Sioux and Mendota were finalized, the Dakota were moved to the Lower Sioux Agency along the Minnesota River, and their homelands were open to settlers, including a number of Norwegian immigrants who arrived in what is now Nerstrand, Minnesota. By 1858, an itinerant pastor baptized 33 children under this large bur oak in a cemetery. There's another story of that oak tree's demise in 2018. In 1859, Bernd Julius Moos, one of the founders of St. Olaf College, arrived from Norway to oversee the growing flock. In 1862, the year of the U.S.-Dakota War, the Norwegian immigrant farmers began to build the stone church quarried from limestone from Prairie Creek, which is about a quarter of a mile away. In 1874, they installed this large bell from Troy, New York. It was shipped first by train, then by boat up the Mississippi, and finally by wagon to Valley Grove. Excuse me, I slipped on. There we go. Very delicate. Oop, there we go. This 1880 photograph shows the interior of the stone church. It's packed with parishioners, obviously. Women on the left, men on the right. We don't know who the gentleman is in the lower right. We have suspicions about who he might have been. But Pastor Quammen is in the pulpit beneath an intricate hand-carved wooden arch that tied the two sides of the balcony together and a very fancy chandelier. Pastor Quammen became known as the skiing pastor because he traveled between parishes on skis in the winter. The congregation continued to grow until 1894, when they needed more space. The congregants who lived in Nerstrand itself wanted to have their own church building. So in 1894, 2 identical churches, wooden churches, were built. One in Nerstrand, which is now called Grace Lutheran Church, and the other facing the old stone church. The Ladies' Aid Society used their egg money to remodel the stone church to become a place for social gatherings and lutefisk dinners. The rural Valley Grove Church and congregation gradually dwindled after World War II until 1973, when they could no longer support a pastor or maintain the buildings. The two congregations formed the Valley Grove Grace Cemetery Association to support the surrounding cemetery, which is still in use today. The stone church functioned as the cemetery's Cemetery Association's indoor gathering space, but the unused wooden church fell into disrepair. The cemetery board considered inviting the Nerstrand Fire Department to come and burn the wooden church for practice. When the neighbors got wind of that idea, neighbors including St. Olaf art professor John Mockestead and his wife Bobby, they flew into action and formed what became the Valley Grove Preservation Society. After some legal wrangling, the Preservation Society and the Cemetery Association agreed in 1975 to turn the wooden church over to the society in exchange for maintaining it. After the Preservation Society raised enough money to pay off their legal debt, they continued fundraising to purchase materials to help renovate the wooden church. In 1985, the two churches and the adjoining cemetery were added to the National Register of Historic Places. It wasn't until the 1990s that serious renovations began on the wooden church. A new roof, steeple repair, a new furnace and ductwork, organ repair on the organ that was shipped in 1911, a security system, and more. The 1990s also launched some of the traditions that the Preservation Society has maintained. A Christmas Eve service in English and Norwegian began in 1994 and continues to this day. The September Country Social began in 1995. 6 years ago, at the Country Social, Governor Al Quie told stories of attending the Valley Grove Church as a kid. His burial took place in the cemetery just about 2 weeks ago. In 2000, a developer offered the adjacent landowner over $400,000 for the property so that the developer could build McMansions on 3-acre lots. Within 6 months, the Preservation Society had raised the necessary funds to buy the land and put a conservation easement over the property. They thought it was important to preserve the integrity of the overall site for the churches and the cemetery. In 2001, a major prairie restoration project with a DNR conservation easement and the first forest legacy program in the state was started. The oak savanna requires regular maintenance, planting of trees and prairie plants, weeding out invasive species, and seasonal burning. In 2005, the cemetery board leased the stone church to the Preservation Society for $1 for 50 years. The understanding was that it was time to do some work on that building, and the Cemetery Association wasn't quite equipped to do that. It had been modernized in the 1940s, the stone church, with an updated kitchen and a lowered ceiling. But now the whole building needed attention. It needed a new roof, a new floor indoors. It needed a new steeple. It needed a lot of work. When the lowered ceiling was removed, a board was found in the balcony with a sketch of a rooster for the long-lost finial. The Norwegian carpenter had written in Norwegian on that board, "So here is how it should be." That's the photo on the far left. It's pretty vague, but there's a little rooster sketch, and up above is this kind of script in Norwegian. John Mockestead drew a similar rooster that Lockerbie sheet metal in Faribault, fabricated in copper, and installed atop the new steeple. With state grants, a reproduction chandelier and wall sconces brought back the elegance of the 1880s. Also better lighting generally. And thanks to the PSP grant, Robbie LaFleur's tapestries, based on stories about Valley Grove's flora and fauna, the people, the buildings, its history. They were all woven in traditional colors and patterns that the original settlers would have recognized in Norway. And I brought the 4 tapestries here for you to take a closer look at. They become a traveling exhibit in the winter because the stone church is unheated and locked at that time. So we send them out to places that are of interest in Nordic arts, and they can exhibit them in their own space from like November through April. And then they come back, we dust off the stone church, clean it up for the Trondhjem, and then we hang them back up on the wall. The churches host numerous weddings, organ recitals, family reunions, funeral gatherings, art exhibits, and workshops. Altogether, we've raised over $600,000 in almost 30 years. And we continue to host fundraising gatherings for ongoing renovations. We invite people to bundle up in February and roast donut holes in fire pits outside the churches. That actually started during the pandemic because we couldn't host the Christmas Eve service. So we thought, well, why don't we go outdoors and roast donut holes? And that's become such a popular event that we have continued. In May, we host a Trondhjem celebration where people gather to celebrate their Norwegian heritage. Because in the end, the Valley Grove Preservation Society is all about preserving the 2 iconic churches and the surrounding landscape so that people have a place to gather, to share stories, and to carry on old traditions and create new ones. Thank you.
All right. And then as noted, so Nancy Norton was supposed to be here with us today, and I realized I was going to read her bio when we introduced ourselves, and I did not do that. So I will do that now briefly. I'll show you a picture of Trondhjem while I do that. So Nancy Halverson Norton has a BA from St. Olaf College in Psychology and American Studies and a JD from William Mitchell College of Law. Her father grew up in the close-knit community of Trondhjem near Lonsdale, Minnesota, attending the historic immigrant church, which is listed on the National Register of Historic Places and lovingly maintained by the Trondhjem Community Preservation Society. As Society President, Nancy has applied for and has managed the grants for historic Trondhjem through Partners for Sacred Places. So I am going to do my best to talk to you about historic Trondhjem Lutheran Church. This is the church, the historic church that was built by a congregation that was founded in 1876 by Norwegian immigrants from Trondhjem, Norway. There was an initial church built on this site. This church dates to 1899. It was built by Marcus Holm, as you see here, and his brother Julius is the one who painted their altar painting that you'll see a picture of in a minute. The congregation was active in this building until 1988, at which point they moved a half mile down the road, closer to the highway. So if you were to drive by this area, the first church that you'll see coming off the highway is the new church that the congregation built. And then if you look down the road, you'll see the steeple among the trees of the historic building. And the Trondhjem Community Preservation Society was founded after the active congregation moved to care for this historic structure. That was in 1988, and the society was founded by descendants of members from the original congregation, as well as interested members of the community. Margit talked a little bit about the cemetery at Valley Grove. Trondhjem has one of those as well across the road. This is a picture of it in current day. So you'll see this piece here in the center is the historic structure. My understanding is that there used to be a smaller edition where you see the current edition that was made bigger to house a museum. So Trondhjem has both a historic church and then a museum building on site where they hold events, and they have quite a few artifacts displayed in there as well. They've undertaken a series of projects over the years. One of the first was to restore the roof, and that was in 1998. And my understanding from Nancy is that that was quite a feat. As you'll see, the roof line is a little bit complicated in that there are multiple gables and how things come together, and you can't see very well on the steeple, but the steeple has these cedar shingles that are like, I don't know what the technical architectural term is, but like fish scale. So a little bit different detail on the steeple as from the main body of the church. So they restored the roof in 1998. In 2000, they took on an exterior siding and window project. And in 2001, they restored the paint in the interior. And I think Nancy has some slides in here regarding that as well. And I believe in 2002, they received an award for the restoration work from the Preservation Alliance of Minnesota. Here we go. Yes. 2002, Preservation Alliance of Minnesota Award. So if Nancy were here, one of the things that she would definitely highlight in regard to the painting restoration on the interior of this church is that when the Preservation Society, the Trondhjem Preservation Society, came into care and stewardship of this building, the building had an acoustic ceiling tile laid over. So I don't know exactly where, but I think as you go into the chancel area where that first set of lines is approximately sort of where that ceiling would have hung. And one of the things that she'll talk about over and over is how grateful she is that that was the strategy that they had gone with instead of painting over or doing some sort of other treatment to this painting, which made their restoration of the original much easier. The altar painting that they have there is, you can kind of see it. It is a Christ at Gethsemane, but it's a slightly different version of that than you usually see. The one that you frequently will see is Jesus with his hands folded and the light coming down, and this has Jesus and the disciples. So it's a slightly different setting, but it was originally painted by Julius Holm, who is the brother of the builder of the church, Marcus Holm. The stenciling is really fascinating. So again, like I noted, most of the time with the stenciling, we don't know who originally did the stenciling, but this features 70 lines. So right where that chancel, you see those lines, and then up through the ceiling, there's 70 separate lines painted entirely by hand at the time, and they are very straight. I was just there last week. They are very straight. And it's mind-boggling to me how someone could paint that so straight with no sort of modern guides. They had done, again, in 2001, that was the paint restoration. And you'll see the darkened pieces of the paint. They left those how they were originally. So my understanding also, I wish Nancy were here to talk about this, but my understanding is that the original is still that dark coloring, and then the new paint is the lighter pieces. Here's a closer up detail of all of those lines. And again, so you can see the altar painting a little bit better here. And this is very standard for what you would find in a lot of Nordic churches, with the altar surround that railing, and then the carved wood where the altar painting is set in. And they also have, you can't really see it in this detail, but they have some of those Hardanger paraments. So that altar cloth is Hardanger embroidery as well. Oh yeah, there you go. Jesus of Gethsemane. So as I said, both Valley Grove and Trondhjem participated in both phases of grants. So their Trondhjem's phase 1 grant was to do some exterior painting and cleaning, but then to also clean and restore their altar painting. So over time, candles, there were a lot of candles in historic churches, and other sorts of things would cloud the painting and make them dirty. And so there were a number of churches in the program in phase 1 who chose to restore altar paintings as part of their work. The other really cool thing, and my notes on this from Nancy are far over there, so I'm going to do my best here too. One of the things that's really unique about Trondhjem that we haven't really seen in other Nordic churches that we've surveyed is this Eye of God window. And this, I don't have a picture of the before, so this is the after. But the painting was originally reverse glass painting. So my understanding is that you would paint it on one side of the glass, but it's designed to be viewed on the other side. And this window, if you remember the front facade photo, there's a circular window in the front facade where this Eye of God sits. And so by the time we came around to 2018, 2019 with the first phase of work, that painting was very not in great shape. And so one of the things that they wanted to do with the grant funding was to restore this Eye of God window that's very unique. And they went back and forth for quite some time as to whether it would be something where they would find a painter to repaint the window, or if they would choose to restore it in some other fashion. And so the decision was made by the team to use new technology to look at the original window and make a 3D printout of, or I can't remember. I can tell my notes if anyone's really interested in this sort of piece of the process. But they used new technology to create a new copy of what the eye had originally looked like. So this on the right is what it looks like now from the road. Trondhjem's phase 2 grant, Valley Grove, as you'll see, were these 4 tapestries, which we definitely encourage you to come take a look at. Trondhjem commissioned a couple of pieces of rose malling. So the congregation at Trondhjem is Norwegian from Trondheim, Norway. And so it was very important to them as a community to commission rose malling specific to their part of Norway. So these pieces are in the Trøndelag style of rose malling. On the left, you'll see 2 cabinet doors that are replicas of doors in one of the museums in Norway. And then the one on the right is a bowl originally turned by someone named Paul Lofness, who's very well known. And both of these pieces also were rose malled by a woman named Louise Bath, who's based in Denver and is a Vesterheim gold medalist in rose malling. So they commissioned these pieces as part of the grant, and then held a community rose malling class, which Margaret and I both attended. I think it was a year or 2 ago. So Louise, who's there in the center, came from Colorado to Lonsdale, Minnesota. This is their museum space to teach a number of us how to do rose malling. We all came away with a couple of ornaments to hang on our trees, and I came away even more impressed with people who have studied and practiced this, because it's harder than it looks. It's definitely a lot harder than it looks. But that was what they had chose to do as far as community engagement with their project. And so with that, we'd love to open this up. Oh, I have one quote that I'll read from Nancy that she sent this morning. So she says, I think working on and under this grant was an energizing experience for me and our board. It not only gave us new opportunities, but reinforced for us how beautiful and unique our historic church is and the importance of folk art to our founders as well. So I have a few questions that I can lead into and ask Margaret if there are no questions, but we'd love to hear from you as well. I'm going to see if I can get this out of here. Any questions from you all? So the question is, how do you begin that process? And I'm not even going to try to pronounce, but it sounds like you are familiar with this church that's near Nerstrand. Eisvold? Slogan.
I don't know personally the background of that church. I know of it, but I don't know anything more about it.
Oh, okay. So is the question about how do you begin the process of becoming Valley Grove Preservation Society or Trondhjem Community Preservation Society and to do that work?
Right. So the question is, how do you begin to preserve an old rural church that literally is out in the middle of nowhere and be assured that it won't be vandalized? That's a good question. We have some very old-fashioned locks on the stone church. It's crazy. And the wooden church has an alarm system built into it so that if someone were to break in through the doors, the alarm goes off. And I mentioned early that a number of the people on the board who have been on the board for a long time are neighbors. So they live literally across the street, down the road, whatever. So there's a certain amount of kind of drive-by, keeping an eye on things. But there is a story that when the land adjacent to the churches was being eyed for development, and we had to suddenly come up with $400,000 to counter the developer's offer, a sizable check came from someone who lives out of state now. And he enclosed in his check an explanation that as a high school student, he and his buddy broke one of the windows in the wooden church and entered at night as a prank. They didn't really do anything. I mean, they got in there and they looked around and apparently they left again. But he'd always felt so badly about that break-in because nobody knew who had done it. And it cost some money to repair it. Anyway, he sent a sizable check as, his recompense for his illegal activity as a youth. But yeah, generally, I think just people in the neighborhood, in the area, keep an eye on it. Yeah. Well, if you will all keep this under wraps, the alarm doesn't go anywhere. It just sounds very loud. It's scary. Yeah. I mean, I asked that because when I was given a key and you have to rush into the wooden church, you have to rush into a little closet and you have to flip the alarm off. It's very nerve-wracking to open that church. I was told, well, if the alarm goes off, I'm thinking Nerstrand Fire Department, Northfield Police, nobody comes. So don't tell anyone, okay? Please, yeah. It's a concern. I know that Trondhjem has insurance on their building. We do not yet. That's kind of an issue for this board because a number of old timers don't think we need insurance other than liability insurance for the board and the surroundings. But you know, a lot of money has been invested in maintaining and improving those two old buildings. And so this is a debate currently on our board. So there is an organization that apparently insures historic buildings that are not in active use. So we're trying to, and I got that information from Nancy Norton, so she would be the go-to person for that.
So Nancy Norton is our third presenter, but if you have those sorts of questions, she had mentioned that she's very willing to field some of those sorts of questions. So we can, if we want to exchange contact information, we can work towards getting you some of that information. But Margaret, as you were talking, I was thinking about another, you mentioned the person who gave a sizable donation towards the land. And I'll say throughout the program, working with all of these churches, something that we've seen time and time again is the importance to reaching out to people in the local community, but also people who have had some kind of historic connection to the church in the past. So I'm thinking particularly of a church in North Dakota. It's Vidalin Icelandic Lutheran Church is the church, and it's probably like an hour or so from the Canadian border. But they also had a cemetery, and I don't, maybe this is something that you've done as well, but they had a cemetery where they have someone who was on the board who had done a lot of genealogical research, and they took the information from the cemetery for who is buried there, and they reached out to the descendants of the people who were buried there to build that connection. First of all, the first ask was not financial for money, but after building that relationship, they did reach out and ask for financial support for continued preservation of the church. And one particular campaign that came shortly before their admittance into the program in 2018, they raised $40,000 just from a letter campaign to those individuals. And we've also seen this done with stained glass across in this project, and then also even outside of it, we've seen this done with names in stained glass windows as well, if that's something that you have in your churches. Yes. Yes, they are in this presentation a few slides back. They are fantastic. Oh, great. Yeah, glad to. Trinity Lutheran in Henning, Minnesota. I kind of want to scroll. I'm going to scroll back just because it's very, I don't believe it's active. Yes. I'm trying. It's a lot of slides. We're close. There. And I haven't seen too many, and there's maybe more in the database. I know Trinity is in our database that's hosted on NordicAmericanChurches.org, but I haven't seen very many that have this dual spire in the center, which I think is very unique to this church. It's a great one. Yes, I have been in contact with people at Trinity. Yeah, they are great. Definitely visit Trinity, visit Valley Grove, visit Trondhjem. You should see them all. And I don't know, Margaret, do you want to say a little bit about if people wanted to come to Valley Grove, what that would look like?
Right. Yeah, Emily asked me earlier, how do people see the interiors of these twin churches or these two churches when we aren't having the country social or the Sutton Mai or the Christmas Eve service. Those are really the three events during the year when the churches are open. On our website, which is valleygrovemn.org, you can contact the president at valleygrovemn.org, I think it is. And that message will get to the person who reads the contact emails, and they'll contact one of the neighbors. And there, as I say, there's several neighbors who will make arrangements to come up and open both churches for you to look at their interiors. I've been impressed with Trondhjem because they have such a ornate interior in their church. And the wooden church at Valley Grove is quite plain. I think it perhaps always was and is likely to remain that way because we spend most of our money on trying to preserve the exterior and the steeple. But the stone church is also plain in its own way, although the tapestries have definitely added a note of color and vibrancy that I think has really enhanced the interior of the building. Someone had asked me one time about the carved wooden arch in the stone church, which was perhaps the most ornate part of that building in the late 19th century. And there was quite a discussion before I joined the board about finding a wood carver to make a new wooden arch. And they found someone in Wisconsin who would be able to do it. But he looked at it and he looked at the building and he said, if I carved a new wooden arch, it would come to the same sad end that this one probably did. And that is with an unheated church, expanding, thawing, moisture, whatever. I'm sure this one just disintegrated. And he forecast that his would too. We've talked in the meantime, or since then, about, well, how about a 3D printer? Reproduction. But Robbie LaFleur took it upon herself to, and you can actually see it in the skiing pastor tapestry. She incorporated the design from the wooden arch in the tapestry. So we're kind of figuring that's good enough for the foreseeable future. But the interiors are not fancy, but they're certainly lovely in their own way, and the exteriors and the position of the two churches. And particularly this time of year, if you go to Valley Grove, like with a picnic in the cemetery, you look south toward Nerstrand State Park, and it is just a blaze of color down there. It's gorgeous. So I highly recommend it. The sconces, I don't know a lot about the sconces because that, again, was before my time. You probably know more. That was phase one.
Yeah, well, so I know a little bit about the sconces as well. So Margaret was talking about this arch, which was part of the discussion with Valley Grove as to their first phase work. There was continued discussion still as to whether they would be able to replicate the Sacanthus style arch. And instead of doing the arch, based on conversations with wood carvers, they pivoted to these sconces that you'll see. And when these tapestries that are here in front of us are hanging in the church, they hang under the sconces from the first phase. So the Valley Grove board worked really hard to, I forget who you worked with a lighting specialist to replicate the sconces that had originally hung in those locations in the stone church. So it is rather plain, but it does these sconces were something that were originally part of that building. And now these tapestries in good weather hang under those sconces in that church as well. Other questions from you all? Margaret, I'd be interested, could you talk a little bit around for the phase 2 work with the tapestries? What was your process around finding a folk artist to work with, finding Robbie, and what challenges were presented? What sort of high moments? Could you speak a little to that process?
again, this started after the wood carver said that the arch was not possible. And so one of the earlier board members, who has many relatives buried in the cemetery, so she goes way back. This is Marlene Halverson. Barbara may know her. She had gone to Vesterheim, to Norway House. Those were the two primary sources that she went to find craftspeople who could come and demonstrate sort of Norwegian inspired crafts at our country social, kind of as an added feature, because we have various activities, wagon rides and rope making, and I don't know what all at the country social. So she had already compiled a list of craftspeople who might be possible demonstrators at the country social. And when the wooden arch idea fell through, quite literally, she came up with Robbie LaFleur's name and contacted Robbie. And Robbie, who lives in the Twin Cities and is quite an active member of the Minnesota Weavers Guild. She's actually a retired research librarian, but she is a weaver, and she oversees the Scandinavian part of the Minnesota Weavers Guild and publishes a Nordic weaving newsletter. So she does a variety of things. So she's very knowledgeable, and she's gotten awards at Vesterheim for her work. She replied that she really doesn't do commissions. Thank you very much. She doesn't like to be told what to do when she does her weavings, which I can understand as an independent artist. So she was reluctant, but Marlene convinced her to come down and look at the site and hear some of the stories. And so she did. And probably one of the hurdles was it was during kind of the height of COVID. So we're kind of trundling around with our masks on and trying to tell her some stories about the history of the church and the first settlers and whatnot. And she got pretty interested in the stories. And I think that was what convinced her to take on this commission. And she was going to do them kind of sequentially, but she realized at one point early in the design process, she just began to get stories and sort of pulling these together. She'd have to design all of them at one time to kind of figure out which images would go where. And then she's incorporated a lot of traditional Norwegian billedvev is the term of the tapestry weaving. The techniques and the motifs. She incorporated traditional motifs into this contemporary set of tapestries. Oh, sure. Yeah, so there's one. So she explains, and in fact, there's a little brochure down here on the table where she explains the history of this tapestry technique in Norway, and then each of the tapestries in turn. And she explains that the bottom pattern on this particular tapestry is a Boldeschoy pattern, which is a very, very renowned kind of almost medieval tapestry. But she inserted the rooster from the finial of the stone church. So she sort of took it upon herself to take some very traditional patterns and then insert things that were specific to Valley Grove. And the tall kind of, you see half a cemetery kind of obelisk on each end of the tapestry. And apparently that is another Norwegian tapestry motif. And then things, I should add that I should have brought a copy. This set of tapestries was exhibited up at the Nordic Center in Duluth last fall as part of its traveling exhibit life. And a professor at UMD made a coloring book because they get grants to bring children to the Nordic Center and learn more about the Nordic arts. And so this professor made this wonderful coloring book and highlighted, the dates and can you find Robbie LaFleur's initials and things that look like a comb, like in the upper right corner. That's actually a very old traditional Norwegian pattern in tapestry weaving. So it was a way of kind of drawing the children into each of the tapestries. And then there are pages when they can design their own tapestries and they can come up with their own images. Another time, this particular tapestry, Robbie had seen a photograph of an older woman, one of the Ladies' Aid Society women. And when we had the grand opening on our first Sunday Mai celebration in 2022, one of the visitors from the Twin Cities said, well, that was my great-grandmother. That's Barrett Hope. And sure enough, there is a stone out in the cemetery with Barrett Hope on it, and that's who that is. And she recognized her from the photograph. And later on, the great-granddaughter happens to be the wife of the minister at Lake of the Isles Lutheran Church. So that was the next place that these sets of tapestries were exhibited. And they actually had a photograph of Barrett Hope that they could put next to the tapestry as part of that exhibit. So it has kind of a long reach, which is fun to see that happen. And that is one of the community outreach activities that we look forward to, is to continue to circulate these tapestries when they're not in the stone church, embellishing the rather plain walls. Any other questions? Pardon? Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, we could, if you have any other questions, we'll be happy to field questions. Otherwise, you can gather around and look at the tapestries and ask additional questions if you wish. Were there any other questions you wanted, just sort of general? Oh, the skiing pastor, Pastor Quammen. Again, I think Valley Grove, it's two real strengths. Well, there's several, but one is its location. It is just this iconic location. In fact, I think NPR has a screensaver of Valley Grove that they posted several years ago. So the location and the setting is just unbeatable for a rural church. Secondly, just the history of the families, many of whom still live there. I was out a couple of weeks ago cleaning the cupboard in the stone church, and a woman came with a little whisk broom and a dustpan, and she was a Vesla doll, and there are many Vesla dolls in that cemetery. And she said she comes out, every 2 weeks to sort of clean up the gravestones around her various families. So I think that's one reason that there isn't perhaps more vandalism than there might be, because there are people coming out there all the time. Some bring their dogs and they walk through the oak savanna. Other people come out to tend to the family grave plots. So there's always kind of a little trickle of activity. But what was I talking about? The skiing pastor, exactly. So the third thing that I think is a real strength are the stories. And this is what Robbie LaFleur enjoyed picking up on. So she kind of zeroed in on this idea of Pastor Quammen skiing. Apparently he lived in Farmington and he would ski to Valley Grove in the winter. But there's also another story where Pastor Quammen, it was the spring, and the snow melt was underway, and there was a creek that had risen with the snow melt between his home and Valley Grove. And so he talked to the farmer nearby and asked if he could buy or borrow the pig trough. So I guess maybe he had skied that far. The creek was open, it was flowing high, and so he loaded his skis and himself into the pig trough and floated across the creek, got out, and then continued on to Valley Grove. So these stories give you a sense of the kind of perseverance and imagination and just dogged determination that these early settlers had, and it's very inspiring. Do I see another hand back there? No? Okay. So Pastor Quammen was the longest serving pastor in that church. So he definitely made his mark on that congregation. I think he may have retired in the early 20th century, like 1907 or something. Yes. Yes, thank you for reminding me. Another project that the Preservation Society worked on was with a local Northfield documentarian, Paul Krause, who made a video of Valley Grove. And again, it happened kind of during the pandemic, so it sort of limited his access to some of the activities that we have. But he did it while Robbie LaFleur was weaving these tapestries, and he went up to see her studio in Minneapolis at one point, and he was so taken with the idea of these tapestries or weaving the stories together, so-called, that I think it's called Valley Grove Tapestry. And it's now on TPT is showing this on a pretty regular basis, you know, how they fill in at night or Sunday morning or something. But it's an hour-long documentary about the history of Valley Grove, and it incorporates the tapestries and the stories behind the tapestries in a pretty effective way. So thank you for reminding me of that. The link to the video is also on our website, valleygrovemin.org. So you can find it anytime. You don't have to wait for TPT to broadcast it.
And then as you were talking about Robbie LaFleur's process as well, she has a blog. So she blogged about this whole process of weaving all of these tapestries. So if you Google Robbie LaFleur's name and you're interested in like more of the process of how these tapestries came to be, you can go back and look at those blog posts as well. But I will take any more questions if you have them, but I also definitely want to give you an opportunity to come up and see these tapestries in person as well.